At 9:27 on a cold, hazy morning over Assam, Philip Adair was doing what every fighter pilot secretly hoped for, a quiet patrol where nothing tried to kill him. 23 years old, 43 combat missions behind him, and still convinced that the P-40 he flew, Lulu Bell, was held together mostly by paint, prayer, and whatever the Curtiss factory swept off the floor. He was circling above the Hump supply route, watching the sun burn off the mist, when something in that mist changed shape. At first, it looked like a smudge on his canopy. Then, the smudge became lines. Then, wings. Many, many wings. 3 miles east, 64 Japanese aircraft were sliding into view like a storm front with engines. 24 Ki-21 bombers in tight formation, and stacked above and below them a cloud of K-43 Oscars, fast, nimble, and annoyingly confident. They weren't drifting toward Denjin Airfield. They were aiming for it, straight as an arrow. And Denjin was in no position to receive guests. Below Adair sat 14 C-47 transports, all loaded and fueled for the China run. The lifeline over the Himalayas depended on those cargo ships. Parked near them, a field hospital treating 63 wounded soldiers, men who really didn't need a Japanese bomb dropping through their roof to add to their problems. And stacked in drums across the edge of the strip was enough fuel to keep the entire Hump operation alive for 11 more days. It wasn't just metal lying down there. It was the beating heart of the supply war. For the past 8 weeks, Japan had been trying very hard to stop that heart. 47 Allied transport planes destroyed on the ground, 112 personnel killed in raids up and down northeastern India. Every time the air raid sirens wailed, everyone knew the bombers weren't sightseeing. They came to erase infrastructure, one crater at a time. Adair had read all the briefings. He had memorized the procedures. He knew the drill as well as anyone. If you're outnumbered more than 5-1, you wait. You call your buddies, shadow the formation, and pray reinforcements arrive before the bombs do. It was a sensible plan, designed by sensible people. But sensible people weren't the ones staring at a formation the size of a small town rolling toward an airfield full of wounded and fuel tanks. Reinforcements were 38 minutes away. The Japanese formation was 20 miles out, closing fast. At their speed, they'd be over Denjin long before anyone else could scramble. Adair could almost imagine the report. One pilot observed enemy attack, followed procedure, and returned safely to base. Very professional, very clean, very useless considering the smoking ruins left behind. He checked Lulu Bell's gauges. Fuel topped off, engine humming with the shaky confidence of a machine that knew it had no choice, and looked back at the approaching mass of aircraft. 40 Oscars, 24 bombers, and him. One man in one fighter that every critic had already declared obsolete. If aircraft could talk, the P-40 would probably be saying, "You sure about this?" And Adair, in a moment that future technicians would probably call ill-advised, was already nudging the throttle forward. He didn't have time for doubt. He didn't have time for mathematics. He only had one clear calculation. If he waited, Denjin Airfield would be shredded. If he attacked, maybe, just maybe, he could scatter the bombers, spoil their aim, buy the airfield the seconds it needed to survive. It wasn't heroism. It was the only option left that didn't end with bodies on the runway. Below him, the sun glinted off C-47 wings. Above him, the bombers held their perfect V-shapes, steady and methodical. Behind him, no friendly fighters would arrive in time. Somewhere in the distance, Japanese engines droned like a growing swarm. Adair eased his gloved hand forward, past the point where doctrine said stop, past the point where common sense waved a white flag. Lulu Bell surged as the throttle hit the wall. The nose dropped slightly, the engine roared, and the lone P-40 turned directly towards 64 enemy aircraft. Whatever happened next, he was already committed. From the moment Adair shoved the throttle forward, the fight stopped being theoretical.
Lulu-Bell clawed for altitude, nose lifting as he swung her wide to the south, climbing until the Japanese formation sat below his nose like a slow-moving parade that had taken a very wrong turn. The sun settled behind his right shoulder, throwing his P-40 into the glare. If the Oscars were looking his way, they'd see nothing but brightness and a vague sense that something unpleasant was coming. He eased the nose over and took a long look at the formation. The bombers were in textbook groups, two neat V's locked in step, wings almost overlapping. Above and below them, the Oscars floated in loose layers, like sharks escorting a school of fat, expensive fish. Doctrine said he should go for the fighters first. Doctrine, however, wasn't staring at 14 fully fueled transports and a hospital full of wounded men directly under the bomber's flight path. He ignored the fighters. He rolled Lulu-Bell gently to the left, lined up on the lead bomber of the nearest group, and set his approach from their 7 o'clock high. Not directly behind, not head-on, just off-angle enough to make it hard for their gunners to track him until it was too late. The altimeter unwound as he started his dive. The engine howled. Airspeed slammed past the comfortable zone and kept going. If aircraft had eyebrows, Lulu-Bell would be raising both of them right now. The Japanese crews never saw him coming. At 800 yards, he thumbed the trigger. 6 machine guns lit up the sky, tracers reaching out in a bright, angry arc. The round stitched across the left wing of the lead bomber, walking inward as he held the burst steady. Fabric shredded, metal flashed, and then the left engine coughed into orange flame. Black smoke streamed back across the wing. The bomber lurched, rolled slightly, and dropped out of formation. For a few seconds, the rest of the group tried to hold formation like nothing was wrong. That lasted right up until reality arrived. Pilots flinched. The tight V shuddered and broke. Bomber paths diverged left and right as the crews reacted the way humans always do when the airplane next to them abruptly catches fire. They got away from it. The carefully built geometry of the bombing run dissolved into a messy cluster of individual survival instincts. Adair didn't stick around to admire his handiwork. He punched Lulu-Bell back into the vertical, hauling back until the G's stacked weight on his shoulders and blurred the edges of his vision. Tracers whipped up through the space he'd just vacated. The Oscars had finally woken up. 4 of them dropped out of the upper cover layer, sliding toward him from 10 o'clock high. Sleek, light, and all curves, they moved like someone had designed them specifically to make Allied pilots swear. They could turn inside almost anything America had in theater. In a fair fight, they would simply circle until the heavier enemy bled off speed, then pick them apart. Adair, fortunately, had no plans for a fair fight. He rolled left, brought his nose slightly above the lead Oscar, and snapped a quick burst. The range was long and the deflection tricky. His tracers went high, slicing harmlessly through empty sky, as the Japanese pilot broke right in a hard turn that no P-40 could hope to match. The wingman followed, the pair curving around like they were dancing on a string. That was fine. If they wanted to show off their turning radius, they could do it somewhere that wasn't between him and the bombers. Behind the fighter screen, the bombers were already trying to pull themselves back into order. The group he had broken apart was drifting, but the other Sally formations held their lines and edged closer to Denjin. 20 miles, then 19. They didn't need perfect geometry to hit an airfield, just enough coherence to get most of their bombs in the same postal code. Adair let the Oscars swing away in their glorious arc and shoved Lulu-Bell back into the dive. Speed was his one reliable advantage here. He dropped his nose through a loose pair of fighters coming down from above. They tried to cut him off, but the P-40 simply outpaced them in the plunge. The altimeter unwound again. His world narrowed to the crosshairs and the lead bomber of the next intact V. 300 yards. He squeezed the trigger. This time his rounds walked in from the right. The bomber's engine nacelle erupted in a flash. Flames trailed back along the wing. One Sally rolled away, bleeding altitude, its wingman yanking hard to avoid the debris. Another bomber in the group jerked out of position as the crew reacted. In seconds, the clean V fractured again. Above, the Oscars were now fully committed. They plunged in groups, trying to intercept him before he could make a third pass. The sky around Lulubelle started to fill with thin lines of tracer, red and white threads that cut across his flight path. He jinked, heaved the stick over, and kept his speed high. The worst thing he could do now was slow down and accept a turning fight. A P-40 that tried to dance with an Oscar didn't last long. A P-40 that treated the Oscars like temporary scenery had a chance. He checked his ammo counters between maneuvers. He had already spent a solid chunk of his fire on those 2 passes. The guns had about 12 seconds of continuous fire when full. He was down to maybe 6 or 7 good bursts. 6 or 7 chances to convince 24 bombers to go home early. The formation ahead was now a mess of staggered altitude and spacing. Some bombers had started a shallow climb, trying to regain the altitude and alignment they needed for an accurate drop. Others held steady, pressing on out of stubbornness or confusion. Adair could almost hear the arguments happening in those cockpits, though he doubted any Japanese crew would phrase it as, "Some lunatic in a P-40 is ruining our day." He swung wide for a heartbeat, gaining just enough distance to reset his approach, then dropped down for a third attack. His target this time wasn't the lead of a perfect V. It was the one bomber that had managed to stabilize near the front of the gaggle, the aircraft everyone else would naturally gravitate around if given the chance. He went for that one. Lulubelle roared past 3 Oscars trying to climb into his path. They fired, but at his speed their deflection angles were brutal. A few rounds snapped past his wings. Nothing important vanished. He leveled out at bomber altitude, lined up through the gun sight, and fired at 250 yards, shorter and sharper this time. Tracers bored into the wing root of the Sally, right where metal and structure were thickest. For a second, nothing happened. Then the outer wing panel folded upward like someone had flicked a switch. The bomber rolled inverted, lost lift, and dropped into a spin, trailing fire. The effect on the remaining crews was immediate. Formations weren't just loose now, they were gone. Individual bombers shoved their throttles forward, broke away from each other, and pointed their noses anywhere that wasn't toward that determined little shark of a P-40 cutting through their flock. Some turned back toward Burma early. Others drifted south or north, trying to find altitude and safety in the empty air. Adair pulled back into a climb again, lungs burning, shoulders aching under the G's. He stole a quick glance at the distance still left to Denjin. They were no longer marching in a unified block toward the airfield. They were scattered across miles of sky. If they dropped now, their bombs would fall across jungle and river and empty ground. Not good for the local wildlife, but far better than delivering high explosives directly to a fuel dump and hospital tents. For the first time since this started, the odds didn't look completely suicidal, just extremely unreasonable. That tiny victory, however, came with a price. The Oscars had finally decided that enough was enough. If the bombers weren't going to get their clean run, then at least they could try to erase the problem that caused it. Lulubelle. A cluster of Oscars dropped out of the higher cover like a pack of wolves peeling off from a ridge. 12 fighters now, converging on his last known attack vector. They had watched his pattern: dive, strike, climb out through the same relative quadrant of the sky. The next time he came up, they were waiting. Adair saw the first pair slide in from above his right wing, then a second pair from 11 o'clock, then shapes behind him closing at different angles. The bomber threat was bleeding away, but the fighter threat was now fully alive. The sky around him started to light up with muzzle flashes. Tracers crossed in front of his nose, snapped past his canopy, stitched under his wings. He shoved Lulubelle through another hard break, feeling the airframe protest as the G's piled up again. This time, though, there was no open gap to run into, no untouched patch of sky. Wherever he rolled, Oscars were there, cutting angles, closing the distance. Behind them, far back among the drifting bombers, the raid on Denjin airfield was effectively broken. No tight V remained in position.
No clean, coordinated run would happen today. But up here, in the tearing wind and screaming engine and rising temperature gauges, the fight was no longer about airfields or supply lines. It was about one P-40 that had embarrassed an entire formation, and a group of Oscar pilots who now wanted to fix that oversight the old-fashioned way, by turning Lulu Bell into a smoking hole in the jungle. Adair barely had time to register the first burst that hit him. One moment, Lulu Bell was clawing through the sky, shaking off tracers and howling at full power. The next, something slammed into the right wing with a sound like someone ripping a metal door off its hinges. Fabric fluttered, metal twisted, and the control stick in his hand suddenly felt wrong, mushy, delayed. Another burst stitched across the nose, sparks bouncing off the cowling. One round slipped through exactly the wrong spot, because of course it did, and the coolant tank gave up its life with a spray that hit the canopy like green rain. The temperature gauge leapt upward, as if excited to participate. The engine's tone changed too, going from irritated roar to the sort of deep growl that suggested a mechanical animal discovering pain for the first time. Then, the smoke started. It curled up from the footwells first, thin and gray, almost polite. Then the wires behind the panel joined in, adding a harsher, burnt electrical bite. In seconds, the cockpit felt like a badly designed fireplace. Adair cracked the canopy, letting the wind blast the smoke back, though it also tried its best to suck his lungs out through his teeth. Behind him, the Oscars tightened their circle, watching the damage spread like spectators waiting for the main act. They didn't rush in. They'd seen this show before. Allied fighter takes a few hits, engine coughs, pilot tries to run, aircraft bleeds speed, the jungle gets a new smoking crater. They were escort fighters, not executioners. Their job was to keep bombers safe, not chase one angry P-40 across half of India. And they had already spent dive after dive trying to catch him. Now, with the bomber attack broken and only one crippled American fighter left, they were content to shadow him and let gravity do the heavy lifting. Adair leveled out at 8,000 feet, but the engine heat climbed past anything that belonged on a functioning airplane. The oil pressure needle dropped like a stone trying to get away from the chaos. When the first thin flame licked through the seams of the cowling, he smacked the throttle closed by instinct. The RPM dipped, but so did the nose. And the moment he pulled back, the cracked elevator linkage barely responded. It was like steering through wet concrete. Below him stretched nothing but jungle, green, endless, indifferent. 12 miles back to friendly ground if the airplane could hold altitude. 5 minutes maybe. 10 if the engine found the courage to keep turning. A minute or two if it quit right now. He needed altitude. He needed control. He needed a miracle, or at least a very creative reinterpretation of aerodynamics. The idea arrived not as a brilliant flash, but as a quiet whisper of training memory, something an instructor once said about how damaged controls sometimes behave backward when inverted. At the time, Adair had laughed it off, mostly because his instructor delivered it in the same tone used for phrases like, "Don't lick the propeller." But right now, with the P-40's right aileron pulling the wing down and the elevator cables half chewed through, backward might be exactly what he needed. He took a breath, instantly regretted it because smoke scraped the inside of his lungs, and rolled the airplane upside down. Pressure flipped direction. Negative G's shoved him into his harness, blood rushing to his forehead so quickly the edges of his vision took on a red halo. Lulu Bell hung in the air like she wasn't sure whether to fall or fly.
But the damaged aileron suddenly behaved as if it had reconsidered its life choices, pushing the wing into a position that leveled the aircraft rather than rolling it into the jungle. The stuck elevator, trimmed nose down in upright flight, now forced the nose up while inverted. It was ridiculous. It was desperate. It also worked. He gained 50 feet, then 100, slowly, shakily, like an injured animal refusing to lie down. But the inverted attitude starved the engine, so after 30 seconds of choking and sputtering, Adair rolled upright again. Immediately, the nose dropped.
Altitude bled. The jungle reached up. He rolled inverted again, clawing back altitude one upside-down gasp at a time. The Oscars above watched this display with the caution normally reserved for unpredictable madmen. One dove closer out of curiosity took a look at a P-40 climbing upside down through a column of smoke and wisely decided the American pilot might be cursed, or immortal, or both. The fighter broke off and rejoined the others. No one wanted to be the guy who got shot down by an airplane that couldn't even decide which way was up. Back and forth Adair went, upright, inverted, upright again. Each transition jarring the controls, slamming his vision to gray whenever the blood rushed too fast. His arms trembled, his chest burned. The smoke made every breath feel like inhaling sandpaper, but mile by mile, foot by foot, the P-40 crept southwest. Somewhere between the 10th and 15th cycle, the engine fire flickered out, probably because there was nothing left inside that could burn. The oil pressure gauge had quit completely. The needle simply gave up and lay flat. Yet somehow, the propeller kept spinning. Not smoothly, not happily, but spinning. At 4,000 feet, the ground finally offered him a sliver of hope. Far ahead, cutting through the jungle canopy like a silver scar, lay the runway at Nguli. It looked impossibly small. So small that any sane man would assume it was just a riverbank or the world's most optimistic rice paddy. But it was real. It was home. And it was getting closer. Closer, and yet still far enough to be dangerous. The engine coughed, the RPM dipped, the whole airframe shuddered with a sound that felt like metal chewing other, more important metal. He was losing power, losing airspeed, losing the ability to pretend this might end cleanly. Worse, he'd need the landing gear down before the engine completely died. Hydraulic pressure was miserable. The gear handle did nothing. He had one backup, a manual pump low on the left side. He wedged the stick with his knee, grabbed the pump with both hands, and worked it like someone trying to restart a stalled heart. The first few strokes did nothing. Then something clunked beneath him. A gear leg locking down. Then another. Drag increased. Airspeed slipped. The runway inched closer. Smoke still streamed past the open canopy. His shirt clung to him with sweat and fumes. His vision tunneled at the edges, darkening as carbon monoxide stole whatever focus he had left. But as long as Lulu Bell could stay in the air for one more minute, just one, they could make the threshold. Nguli widened ahead of him. The engine sputtered, caught, sputtered again. The propeller spin slowed, more wind-driven than powered now. Adair gripped the stick, forcing the wobbling wings level. The runway was right there. One more minute. And the engine was beginning to die. The propeller finally gave up with a shudder that felt almost personal, as if the engine had turned to him and said, "I've done all I can, buddy. You're on your own." The nose dipped, the airspeed bled away, and the P-40 became a very heavy, very unfriendly glider with absolutely no interest in helping him. No flaps, barely any elevator authority, landing gear hanging out like two tired legs. Perfect conditions for a disaster. Ngula's runway slid into view below him, long, narrow, and looking much too small for the amount of drama currently attached to this approach.
He rolled inverted one last time, letting the nose rise just enough to stretch the glide. The world flipped upside down again, the jungle suddenly above his head, the runway somewhere beneath his boots. Blood rushed to his forehead, vision tightening, just a ring of color framed by trembling edges. And then, with the altitude dropping faster than his comfort level, he rolled Lulu Bell upright for the final time. The damaged aileron immediately tried to drag the right wing down, but he fought it with every ounce of control the stick still had left. The nose wanted to sink, the aircraft wanted to dive, gravity wanted him very badly. He held the line anyway. The runway threshold rushed toward him like a dare. At 90 feet, then 80, then 50, there was no more room for subtlety. The main wheels slammed into concrete with a jolt that felt like being hit by a truck. The gear groaned, flaxed, and then, unsurprisingly, gave up on the right side. Lulu Bell lurched. The wingtip dug in, and the whole aircraft twisted into a ground loop, spinning on the runway in a shower of sparks and torn metal. For a second, everything went sideways, literally and figuratively. Then the P-40 skidded to a stop, canted at an angle, smoking gently like it was trying to pretend this was all part of the plan. For a long moment, Adair didn't move. Then he unlatched the harness, pushed himself up, and climbed out onto the wing, which sagged under his weight. His legs buckled, but the ground crew caught him before he fell. When they pulled back the cowling, the engine inside looked like it had survived a knife fight with a locomotive. Pistons seized, crankshaft warped, coolant and oil everywhere. Lulu Bell had flown her last flight and had several strong opinions about it. They counted the holes, 16 in the fuselage, 7 in the right wing, 4 in the left, 2 through the electrical system, 1 through the hydraulic reservoir, and 1 that had sliced the aileron cable clean through. It was a miracle the airplane had stayed in the air. It was an even bigger miracle Adair had stayed conscious long enough to bring it home. And yet, for all the wreckage, the result was simple and astonishing. Not a single bomb hit Denjin Airfield. 14 C-47 transports were still intact. The hospital tents stood untouched. The fuel drums, the supply lifeline, the entire Hump operation, they all lived to see another day. 24 bombers had turned back. Dozens of Oscars had escorted them home empty-handed. One pilot in one battered, outdated fighter had broken an entire raid. 3 days later, Adair stood at attention while he received the Silver Star. He went on to fly 95 more combat missions, shot down enough Oscars to earn A status, and eventually retired as a full colonel after 30 years of service. Lulu Bell died on that runway, but the man who coaxed her through the impossible lived long enough to see the story become legend. And the legend holds a simple truth. You can write all the manuals you want, design aircraft with perfect numbers, draw diagrams of ideal engagements, but sometimes war comes down to a pilot who refuses to quit, even when upside down, even when everything is burning, even when the world tells him the fight is already lost.